Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to our discussion today. It's a topic that is a little bit off the normal theme of our meetings, which are oriented towards science and technology, but it has an important bearing. I have become really very appreciative of history in recent years. For example, every morning I wake up to read a column called Letters from an American by Heather Cox Richardson. Some of you may know her. I understood she had some Winchester links at one point, and she writes a wonderful column which puts in, I think, very interesting perspective on current events and historical matters. And I just find it very illuminating and insightful writing. And it puts in perspective why history is so important to us. You know, this old comment about those who don't understand history are doomed to repeat it. I think there's some real truth in that. And Heather makes a wonderful case as she interprets what's going on in the world each morning. And I just find it very interesting. She's a historian, Boston College professor, as I recall. But we have our own resident historian among our group, and that historian is Vincent Dixon. He's well known to all of us. Someone who's spoken to us before. And so, Vincent, I'm just going to turn the floor over to you immediately, and you can begin screen sharing and your presentation.
Thank you, Ron, and hello to everyone. Happy to be here. As you will see in the first couple of slides, I do have kind of 2 feet in one camp, or 2 feet in 2 different camps. The 3-year American history cycle I took with Thomas O'Connor, who was the university historian. I have met Heather Cox Richardson. She's rather interesting. Back when the Republican Party was rather a different creature a few years ago, she wrote essentially a biography of the early years of the Republican Party, which is well worth reading for its scholarly mentality, though she ventures into the current world quite a bit. This particular topic is America's 250th, heading towards it. And we should think about being in that cycle. And we will talk something both about the 250th and its halting steps forward, and some of the history that underlies it. Next.
Trying to work this
We're
out.
trying to get the screen to move here.
Yeah. Okay.
We are on screen share.
It should just be able to. You can't click on.
What are we clicking on?
Click on the down arrow.
Okay, here we go.
Yeah.
This is, of course, the Wilson Science and Tech Group in conjunction with the Jenks Senior Center. Our appreciation to all the various technical people who helped in various ways. And of course, science and tech is something we're well known for. That something can be explored a little bit further. But if you go back to the early days of European settlement here in the Boston area, Boston was gifted with the great harbor, became a great center of commerce. And I've often compared Boston and Cambridge to the Twin Cities of Minnesota. Without the commerce of Boston and the intellect of Cambridge, we wouldn't be where we are today. And they feed in some really interesting ways, very much with biotech and various commerce of today. But this is a broader look. Next. My own background includes having been homeschooled by my parents from kindergarten through high school. My father's family was filled with teachers and librarians, and I think history captures something of that because we're telling stories and facts. I earned an associate in arts and a Bachelor of Arts with honors at Harvard Extension School and a Master of Education from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And in each place I learned history. I engaged with historians of first rank. Pat Graham, who's the first woman dean at Harvard, was an education history specialist, and I had the opportunity to intersect with her over the years as well. Next. This is me giving some tour and historical information right by the John Harvard statue in Harvard Yard by Harvard staff. There are a couple gaps in the summer where Harvard doesn't deliver tours, and they actually did a nice story on all of those who deliver tours when Harvard isn't doing tours. And for those who say that I should teach at Harvard, well, when I'm telling people about Harvard and Massachusetts and the history, I am teaching at Harvard, even if I don't have a tenure track position. Next. For 20 years, I operated the first regular commercial tour of Harvard Square, Harvard Yard, and Cambridge history, and other areas as well. And a lot of people think Harvard Yard is it, when in fact, the School of Education, Sesame Street, the beginning of the U.S. military on Cambridge Common, and a lot else are fairly important in many different ways. Demographics, income, and wealth profiles, and other changes have evolved. And so I don't do those particular tours anymore, but I've developed more in the way of in-person presentations as we reemerge in terms of meetings, and occasionally teaching classes and doing tutoring as well. Next. I launched the Cambridge Advantage Tours back in the late 1990s. And I was surprised pleasantly that tourists who came here were actually more knowledgeable about history and curious about it than people might expect. And so I catered and still cater to the intelligent tourist because, in fact, most tourists are. And my background in history among adults at that, I think helped a great deal. Next. This is Dr. O'Connor, who earned his doctorate from Boston University, taught at Boston College for many years. As some of us say, the Jesuits are the Harvard of the academic world in this area, in the Catholic world. And Dr. O'Connor had what is the newer narrative style, how the history that has occurred over the years relates to very much what we do today. And I think Heather Cox Richardson does something of that as well. I recommend the books that Dr. O'Connor wrote, and I took my courses in American history with him. Nothing more historic than the early 1900s steam pipes in the basement of Old South Church banging away on a February night in a historic building going back centuries. And he actually published a couple of his later books through the Harvard imprint as well. Next. This is a presentation that's a premiere of a fuller presentation on the 250th anniversary. There's still different ways of describing it. The most generally one is the semi-quincentennial, or half of 500 years, though there are a couple of other versions as well. And I think this probably will turn into a modest book updating some of the history of this area, because even I myself, as I was digging through this, found some things that are little known and central to how Massachusetts history and American historical government development occurred. Next. If you have a better title, I'm open to it. In putting these pieces together, it came out that there are about 12 independent actions that led to the history and independence of Massachusetts more fully accomplished: the Liberty Tree protest, the Lexington spinning circle, the Boston Massacre and Boston Tea Party, better known, the Suffolk Resolves, the predecessor of the Declaration of Independence, the Long Ride of Paul Revere, of course, the battles of Lexington, Concord, and Menotomy, the Battle of Chelsea Creek, the Battle of Bunker Hill, the evacuation of Boston, the battle preparations were superseded by the British simply leaving, the Massachusetts Constitution, which fully establishes us as a leader in terms of forms of government, and the U.S. Constitution modeled significantly on aspects of the Massachusetts Constitution. So I'm calling this the Massachusetts Independence 12. Next. We are actually in the 250th anniversary. The first event was 1765. The Liberty Tree protest was, in fact, commemorated, and that is the location downtown Boston, and the Spinners protest as well. Next. We are in this historic period of observance. The National 250th Commission has failed, sadly. One of the top officials was engaged in self-dealing. The current administration has decided to appoint a new chair to try to restart it. In that gap is the Massachusetts observance, the 250th Commission, a proposed $2 million state budget expenditure. There's presently $1 million in the conference committee. Significant credit to Senator Michael Barrett, who has been pushing hard on this. And if you're so inclined, next, we'll talk briefly about a couple things that can be done. The important aspects of the 250th are the opportunity for a civic celebratory focus and enjoyment, civic learning opportunities for students, tourist welcomes and promotions, because regardless of people's politics, people are curious and come here. They may ask about some of the things we do that are a little different, but they are open to learning. And this, of course, brings economic development and improvement opportunities in many ways, and perhaps an opportunity for reestablishing some civic courtesy in the engagement on these issues. Next. The Conference Committee of the State Budget is presently intersects with the House Ways and Means Committee. Representative Aaron Miklowitz is the chair. Representative Ann Margaret Ferranti, the vice chair. The Senate Ways and Means Committee, Senator Michael Rodriguez and Senator Cindy Friedman, nearby Lexington. And if you're inclined to support these expenditures, these are expenditures that are typically extremely valuable. For every dollar spent on tourist promotion, it generally brings in something in the vicinity of $5 to $10. Next. Revolution 250 is the coordinating umbrella with assistance from the Mass Historical Society. They have a valuable website, www.revolution250.org. If you go to that website, there's an email sign up that will provide notifications about a variety of events in coming years. Senator Michael Barrett has been pushing hard for this, noticing the failure of the National Commission and the need for us to have one. One does have to consider the small amount of state revenue that will seed putting together private donations of size, much like what happened with the bicentennial in the 1970s, and the additional issues, of course, that happen with these large events of security, which is an issue, and some of the coordination of various events. Next. There is, of course, the standard history. We know, or think we know, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, and events like that, but they didn't just happen. They develop out of a texture of events that are moving to further defining the independence of Massachusetts from a very early point, and we'll talk about that. The Liberty Tree protest, this location at the corner of Boylston Street, Washington Street, and Essex Street, is important as perhaps the first central location to protest the apparent outrages of British supervised rule. And this was in the 1760s when we're talking about the Stamp Act. You see a depiction here, much like places in England, people gathered. In this case, they protested, and the symbol, the culture of Liberty trees came to be so significant that it was copied throughout the East Coast. Liberty tree locations identified. It was symbolic and a great source of annoyance to the British loyalists. The Stamp Act is a central objection. Gradually, a group called the Sons of Liberty coalesced. Some of them intersected with Masonic groups, some of them didn't, and they became an independent source of action of various kinds, at times not entirely legal, but clearly committed to ultimately a freedom of Massachusetts independent of British rule. This was one of the early events, in fact, we ran across at right opposite the Lexington Green. It was a depiction and a recreation of the actual events when women gathered to complain about the fact English goods coming in, the Stamp Act, and other problems. And they began to homespun fabric on their own that maybe was more modest than beautiful British textiles, but it was in effect the beginning of the American textile industry that Massachusetts ultimately became extremely successful with in the 1800s. Yes. August 31st of 2019, in the afternoon, a group of women assembled in costume, in period, with spinning wheels to spin thread, to talk about the political climate of the British goods, the boycott that came to be, and it was really a preview of various other aspects. Remember the sociological and economic realities of this area, the gradual establishment of successful farms, the clearing of fields, and the commerce of Boston all went together to mean that Boston now had the money to basically go its own way, regardless of the British, whether the British cared or not. The Boston Massacre, of course, is a big event that everyone thinks they know about. In effect, it was a street brawl gone awry. 5 were killed: Crispus Attucks, Samuel Gray, Samuel Maverick, Patrick Carr, and James Caldwell. It provided propaganda which was suitably used by Paul Revere in the notable image shown here. It exaggerates the situation. It looks like the British are simply firing on ordinary people, though there had been a variety of catcalls and yelling and screaming that had occurred in prior incidents over some weeks and months, dirty snowballs and ice thrown at the troops, who eventually felt under attack. There was no command to fire that we know of, but firing occurred. 5 were dead. And clearly, this became an incident that was used by Patriot forces. John Adams, a Patriot lawyer, was extremely understanding of the situation and provided a defense that led to the acquittal of a number of soldiers and the lessening of penalties on those who were convicted. Even though Adams was taking a risk in terms of his Patriot friends, he was understood to be doing, again, many aspects here that go to the rule of law, which is much discussed today. The Boston Tea Party will be the biggest event this year. It will be a very major event. Publicity is being built well beyond Boston. People being invited to provide tea or tea bags. I'm not sure the exact mechanism, but you can see about it. And this will be an event that will be somewhat worldwide in its coverage. And by the way, part of our culture, this is why we drink coffee. It is a cultural artifact of boycotting tea. And the first coffee merchants in Boston came in and were successful because they were offering something that was not tea at the time. The Suffolk Resolves is likely the most important single document of the time, little known. Credit goes to my father and a small number of other people who knew about this growing up. This is a series of specified commitments, including the establishment of a full and complete separate government. Massachusetts essentially lays out the road. Massachusetts, in some sense, forces the issue. Massachusetts, after all, is on the ground with British troops and their own sense of self-government and the struggle between those two views. This is the house that was saved, where the Suffolk Resolves were signed, south of Boston. The Milton Historical Society has this as their headquarters, and there are certain days a year that they're open for public visitation. Well worth the stop. A very strong historical society in that town. September 9, 1774 is when, based on prior work, a number of men gather and they sign a document. The actual discussion and gathering had been going on for a time under the very noses of the supposed British government. Remember, the British had in 1701 issued a new charter for Massachusetts, a British royal governor. From 1630, when the first charter came to Massachusetts, it provided for stockholders to be here in Boston or nearby in Massachusetts. No stockholder meetings in England, no offices there. They have actually begun to set up government as they think it should be, and that's part of what the British don't understand until later. The governor of Massachusetts was elected by the European settlers until 1701, And so from 1701 to 1775, the attempt to have a British royal governor was often resisted, and a great and large standing committee of the Great and General Court, which was upwards of 750 people, a standing committee of upwards of 70 men who were the governor's council, now somewhat more streamlined, but still with some checks and balances on the governor. And this was very much that mentality that leads to these delegates signing a document. And this is the most significant ride of Paul Revere, who rides presumably with different horse mounts along the way as far as Philadelphia. This document then received by the Continental Congress, which ratifies it, endorses it. So really from 1717 of 1774, independent government is being established. In fact, in October of 1774, John Hancock, president of the Provincial Congress of Massachusetts, writes, "Massachusetts is independent of England and the British Empire." And that is definitely a point at which Massachusetts does not ever look back and becomes a distinct and separate country. The Paul Revere Bowl, by the way, is worthy of note because Paul Revere was an extremely active fellow. He was a son of liberty, and this Paul Revere Bowl has often been used to honor someone. It is political in its origin, and it honors the 92 members of the legislature who refused to rescind an anti-imperial letter. And it's striking again that a political thing becomes part of our culture. The Paul Revere Bowl is in fact, the original in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. If you're ever there, it's worth taking a look and notice that the particular body that refused to rescind, the vote was 92 to 17, a particular letter that had objected to what was going on, clearly emphasizing both their freedom of speech and their freedom of action. Next. Lexington conquered in monotony, of course, of the great battles. This is the first actual combat. British troops had conducted forays into other areas, including as far as Salem, where there was an armed confrontation earlier. That confrontation was recognized as being potentially deadly, and so an agreement was shouted back and forth across a local estuary. And it was agreed that the British would be allowed to go across the bridge, a drawbridge, about 100 yards on gentleman's honor, and turn around and march back to their ships and back to Boston. So the spy network of the Patriots had penetrated everything. And in fact, the events of April, it is noted in one writing that the secret came from the heart of the enemy. And it is described that perhaps Margaret Gage, who was a Patriot sympathizer from New Jersey, married to the military governor, Thomas Gage, may have provided the information to the Patriots so they were ready for the British attack on the local populace in the nearby areas. Of course, the Old North Bridge at the point of Lexington was the original conflict. Word of that spread out to Concord. This is the furthest that the British troops reached, and the sarcasm has it that the British Empire has been retreating ever since. Next. Monotony, actually, the original name for Arlington, is where the heaviest fighting went on. The British retreat. The riders were not just Paul Revere, who was briefly arrested, and William Dawes, who I am honored to greet on Patriots' Day on Cambridge Common and provide a brief narration, who did get through successfully, but many other riders, the committees of correspondence that were responsible for propaganda, and the committees of safety that were responsible for coordinating the militias and the military preparations. A committee of the legislature met in Cambridge on the night of April 18th of 1775, well aware that much was about to happen. The British fought their way through what we now call Arlington Center and back through Charlestown, the siege of Boston being underway. Heavy casualties, and the British actually had to fight their way back into Boston It was very close that the militia almost surrounded the British and would have forced a surrender of hundreds of British troops. And the British realized that there was a lot more ahead. Next. The Battle of Chelsea Creek comes along. If you notice closely here, you see the Chelsea Creek, you see Noodles Island and Hog Island, and you see Chelsea. Next. Boston Harbor has 33 islands, and many of which were already in active use for various purposes, including livestock and hay. So both the British and the Patriots recognized the agricultural, economic, and strategic value of these islands. Boston Light was burned down by competing forces at least twice. Very valuable coastlines. Next. Along the way, these skirmishes developed into large-scale operations with hundreds of militia and British troops. And these areas, of course, largely filled in, part of them part of Logan Airport today and Chelsea Creek. The British ship Diana, captain misread the tides, became trapped. Alert Patriot militias focused. The Diana was seized, stripped of its valuables, and burned. Patriots won, British nothing. British had a fleet, but they lost a vessel to a Patriot force that did not yet have vessels of its own. Next. The Battle of Bunker Hill, of course, was the ultimate turning of the siege of Boston, with hundreds dead and little prospect of changing the military balance. The British dared not foray out further. The British, now trapped in Boston, ultimately feel trapped and are forced to consider evacuation. The Provincial Assembly of Massachusetts controlled everything except a few neighborhoods of Boston. And this was important. They also issued letters of privateering to Massachusetts captains sailing out of Salem and other ports. About a third of the British ships coming into Boston were seized. The soldiers turned back to the British lines, and the munitions and food to the cause of the Patriots. So a very active scene. Next. This is actually a reflection of the great success. Remember, March 17 of 1776, St. Patrick's Day, Evacuation Day in Boston, reflects a fundamental and significant fact. Massachusetts, as an independent country with a military man named George Washington, has forced the British to leave a great commercial port. And this is actually a copy of the original Congressional Gold Medal that was specifically authorized to honor George Washington and his generals. On the right, you see the generals watching the British ship sailing out of Boston. The Congressional Gold Medal still honored today by being given to various people in remarkable situations. The original of this, I believe, has at least at some point been in the Boston Public Library. Senator Hart has brought this back to general recognition as a reflection of the fact that Massachusetts and the Continental Army had successfully expelled the British from a port before the Declaration of Independence, but of course Massachusetts regarded itself as independent by this point. The Massachusetts Constitution, of course, after independence, at the original suggestion of John Adams, the results of a convention of Massachusetts held in Harvard Square at the church. John Adams, as a committee of one, creates the Massachusetts Constitution. And the U.S. Constitution, the model of the Massachusetts Constitution, ultimately informs the structure and many of the aspects of the U.S. Constitution. Next. There are other items and a little bit of touchback in history we will note. The Massachusetts Archives over in Columbia Point. Massachusetts state budget, of course, funds that, and the Mass 250th Commission. And if you want to see the original charter, it is on Columbia Point at the Mass Archives adjacent to the Kennedy Presidential Library and the Kennedy Senatorial Center. Secretary Galvin has many responsibilities, but one of them is as chair of the Mass Historical Commission, shepherding and encouraging local historic preservation and publicity efforts. Historical and philosophical developments over history are important. The great English thinker Edmund Burke recognized that when Massachusetts indicated it was setting up its own separate government without reference to the monarch or the parliament, that something profound was going on. Constitutional development in the English world, of course, goes back to the Magna Carta of 1215. In Massachusetts, that mentality had really sunk into the grassroots. So the Mayflower Compact, generally known from 1620, no authority to be in the Plymouth area. They put together an autonomous independent document to give themselves authority. The Massachusetts Bay Charter of 1629 on the land here in 1630 by the Dorchester Company that had had a failed experiment up in the area around Gloucester and Salem. The basic fundamental charters are constitution-like. They've evolved over time. Various laws developed from the Harvard commencement. They're recited over those to receive their degrees in the law, those wise restraints that make us free. And this is the rule of law and the struggle and the philosophical differences about what the rule of law should be, a set of standards that are more objective, and they clearly are driving forces in Massachusetts history. Drumbeat of history is a consistent momentum of events and legal foundations that create the documents that we have and that more broadly are ones that we look at today. The real conflict here about the fact that the evolution is going differently is when Sir Edmund Andros is sent in 1686 by London to take control of these rascally characters in New England. He sets up the Dominion of New England, he attempts to rule New England, New York, and other parts of New Jersey. And on April 18th and 19th of 1689, there are disturbances in Boston. The militia agree at his request to meet the governor. They meet him on April 19th and they arrest him, basically for doing his job, and they restore the charter to themselves. Notice the charter actually was legally vacated by actions in London, but they don't care about that. They understand the charter as it had been originally negotiated, and they simply restore it to themselves as though they have the right to do it, and ipso facto, they make that stick. Simon Bradstreet was a moderate Puritan political figure central to Massachusetts retaining its autonomy and even its independence during this tumultuous period where there's an attempt at a royal government installation, a failure of it, and the efforts of remnants of the church and commerce interests that come together to stabilize what was a chaotic situation. Joseph Dudley is another figure worthy of some note, and we'll talk about him in a more polished presentation. As I did this presentation, I came across several facts that are little recorded, but do exist with records over time. And of course, this would have been Dudley Square that now is called Nubian Square. The siege of Louisburg a little later on is significant because they were largely New England troops that were assembled. They go north, they take Louisburg from the French. At the end of that war, the British in the peace treaty return it to the French. This creates some additional anger. In the meantime, many New England men had gained military experience and military success. And this is something that really feeds the strength of the militia and the later successes. The United Colonies of New England is little known, but it is the first federation with written articles from 1643 to 1690. There's a board of commissioners, 2 commissioners from each of the colonies that are part of it. And remember, the term colonial does confuse some people because colonial is viewed as an extension of the English Empire. In New England, colonial is simply settlers who came and set up their own governments. The board of commissioners were empowered to deal with issues of commerce and peace and war. They conduct King Philip's War in 1675, 1676. Hundreds of settlers killed, injured, towns burned, thousands of Native Americans killed. This war, which was a substantial war that determined the future of New England, was accomplished without any involvement of British troops or British authority of any kind. And it's an interesting early pan-colonial government organization. Possibly it is reported anecdotally with the source of a flag with red and white stripes on a commercial ship in Connecticut. This is a map that shows how New England's confederation was. If you look carefully, you see Plymouth, which was a separate government, Massachusetts Bay that claimed a charter all the way to the Pacific, Connecticut, there was a separate Saybrook colony, there was a separate Hartford colony, Hartford founded by people who had briefly been in Connecticut, Reverend Hooker, who thought the church-state characters in Massachusetts were too liberal for him, kind of humorous at some level. But eventually many of the ministers of Connecticut and Massachusetts are part of what's called the Cambridge Convention or Synod in, I think, about 1648. We'll look on more of that as we look at this. That set about 95 particular religious scriptural references to be guided by the established church. Remember, this was a church state that was largely so until the disestablishment in Massachusetts in 1833. Rhode Island was not part of this. New Hampshire at times was. Maine was part of Massachusetts, of course, until 1820. So you had commissioners between about 6 and 8. They would rotate their meetings between Plymouth, Boston, and Hartford. And they also wrote some treaties with Native American people and really set in path the kind of intercolonial cooperation that New England was quite successful at. Other parts of the United States are still sometimes struggling with that or have sometimes imitated us successfully or otherwise. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress is on the way to the last stages of full independence because they were ordered to dissolve by the governor. And they said, forget it. In fact, it kind of is echoed in the Declaration of Independence, where there's the complaint that people have been ordered to assemble in places inconvenient. In this case, the Massachusetts legislature refused to dissolve. They decided to reconvene elsewhere and establish a full government. And from October 7 of 1774 to October 25 of 1780, when the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Constitution was brought into effect, they were the government of Massachusetts with presiding officers. Presiding officers in turn, the first year was John Hancock, the next year Joseph Warren, who died on Bunker Hill, and James Warren, who was from Plymouth, 1775 to 1780. And it's notable that for a time, and I have to get some more detail on exactly when, that a presiding officer was named Benjamin Lincoln of the Lincolns of Massachusetts, one of whom eventually moves to Pennsylvania and offspring to Illinois, and that's the line of Abraham Lincoln. So the first President Lincoln was perhaps President Lincoln of Massachusetts for a short time during the War of Independence. John Hancock was the first president. He's the one who stipulates that Massachusetts is independent of England and the British Empire. He was a wealthy merchant who had inherited from his uncle at a young age, graduated from Harvard, I believe, at the age of 16, a rascally merchant who didn't believe in the British restrictions and helped to lead to independence in part because of his commercial interests. Joseph Warren died on Bunker Hill, a young man of brilliance, and the British were glad that he had died, and the Patriots were quite sad. Where we see Warren Street or Warren Square, it's probably named after Joseph Warren. James Warren stabilized things a bit, a significant figure in Plymouth, married to one of the Otis family. The Otis family were also patriots with a reason. The Otis father had been denied a promotion to a top judicial position in the British, and his son said the British would pay for that, and surely did, though with powerful rhetoric and action. Benjamin Lincoln here went on to a distinguished career as the second general of George Washington, Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts. The Mass Provincial Congress first met in Concord and then Cambridge, sometimes the second one in Cambridge, Concord, or Watertown. More often, both safe and convenient, was the third Provincial Congress in Watertown. Earlier, actually, during the period of the agitation against the Stamp Act, there was a Massachusetts Convention of Towns. Massachusetts actually considered at one point setting up a separate government in this extra legal assembly, which met at Faneuil Hall. literally a few hundred yards from the then Massachusetts State House we know of as the old State House. For about a week, they debated these issues quite passionately. Thomas Cushing, a relative moderate, stabilized his passions, leading to expressions of concern rather than the pathway by the radicals, including Samuel Adams, who wanted the creation of an independent government, which at this point is avoided. Thomas Cushing is the important moderating influence, goes on to a distinguished career as well. The United Colonies of New England is a book I ran across many years ago. It's a valuable source book. It prints the Articles of Confederation of New England. I recommend it highly. It was a military man who, in his retirement, took up history and produced really one of the great reference sources on many of these issues. Broadly, the history of New England has simple detail, a separate potential history, perhaps a little less aware, broader nationally, but still significant today. Right? There were various native peoples of the Northeast that were significant and continue to be significant, even though they had been defeated by the European settlers. The Treaty of Watertown is the first treaty by an independent state of the United States. July 19 of 1776, apparently Mi'kmaq people can still use this pathway to enter the U.S. military, and many from Canada have done so directly through this avenue. Many American veterans who are Canadian and Mi'kmaq people. When the treaty was consummated, the Mi'kmaq pledged about 600 warriors for the American cause, and there is a small military history between New England and Nova Scotia that goes back earlier in the 1700s. Remember the Continental Army, because it was assumed that Canada was part of the continent. Montreal and Quebec were lost to the American cause because the commander of the troops sent north did not follow the protocols that General Washington had ordered and had not received the variolation that was a early form of inoculation against smallpox. So you could say we lost Canada because smallpox was not controlled. Washington saved Boston from the fuller outbreak that could have happened because he had lost his brother and had fallen ill with it himself at an earlier point. An interesting public health connection. William Dummer was a governor of Massachusetts during the royal period, and he was involved in the border war in Maine with Native American and various other Canadian irregulars, and that can bear further investigation along the way. Later along, I discovered a document called the Explanatory Charter. The confusion that Massachusetts had restored the charter to itself and that the British authorities in London had to put up with some of that, but couldn't answer to all of it and didn't want to, led to, would you believe, an explanatory charter. Imagine a constitution having an explanatory constitution. That's kind of what they had, and it reflects, again, further rule of law development in Massachusetts, quite distinct from the regular pathway throughout the rest of the British Empire. There was this battle and siege up in Nova Scotia during the War of Independence. Again, the border between Canada and the United States is a permeable one, and for many generations was not fully established. The independent Massachusetts government still has today the committee executive of the Governor's Council, now removed from the line of succession. The state constitution was defeated because it was produced by the legislature, and John Adams and other people thought it should be produced by a convention of the people, and that's the document that John Adams helped to write, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Constitution we have today, though with many amendments. From the beginning, the established behavior of the European settlers here in English-oriented development has been not just autonomous, but independent. This means that the flow of Massachusetts history is that of independent and original thinking drawn from other experiences and knowledge, but not seeking authoritative permission, as you find in many other places. Authoritative permission is assumed by the action of free franchise holding individuals. And this, of course, includes the church, the Unitarian schism in the late 1700s and early 1800s, supported by people like John Adams, and the religious and philosophical thinking is influential and continues even to the present, with all the pluses and minuses that go with that. Next. I do encourage you to think about the 250th anniversary that actually we are fully in. Most people will think the July 4th of 2026, the 250th anniversary will be the big thing, and it will be for many people. But in 2025, most of the events and some in 2024 and 2023 later this year to be commemorated. Essentially, the Declaration of Independence is an announcement of what we are doing rather than some kind of new thing that just comes out fully born. And that's important to understand. And if you believe that we should help our economic development a bit, contact your members of the legislature to encourage them to make sure that the very modest amount of money that will publicize tourism is important. Many years ago, in different era, Massachusetts targeted $2 million in advertising to the Mid-Atlantic and border states, and in the next year we gained $10 million in new revenue. So we know that targeted and specified tourist and historical material is of value. We are looking forward. Tell your local historical people, your teachers, your civics people. There is a civic literacy alliance in Massachusetts that has passed some laws that encourage internships in local groups and high schools. And we can imagine, we can speculate and or create here based on this remarkable history. Thank you very much for the time and the opportunity. I'm available for presentations such as this and others as well. And I welcome any questions or thoughts you might have.
Thank you, Vincent. This is a very comprehensive, I guess I should say, perspective on this nation's independence. And, you know, as you were speaking, it reminds me of a number of talks we've had in the past in the forum. The group might remember that I think Bob Lewis spoke about Henry Knox and his campaign to deliver artillery over the Adirondacks, I guess, during the winter.
Right, that's the journey of Colonel Knox, a Boston bookseller of 26 who talked with Washington April of that year, and then in the next winter. In fact, about 10 years ago, somebody tracked the route and found the one cannon that had crashed through the ice lying on the base of a small river stream, and it was recovered.
That's interesting.
So, in fact, these were people who basically understood that they had already operated essentially as independent states and was simply moving forward in that direction. In the 1750s and 60s, some very prescient British thought maybe we can encourage these people to get back with British culture a little. Those small number of people were overridden by other authorities. William Brattle, you might recognize Brattle Street in Cambridge, dropped some letters on his way. A few people picked them up, opened the mail, discovered his reports on his neighbors. He had to leave Cambridge and never come back. Great heartbreak for him, but it also showed that the British were actually spying on the people who might be friendly or unfriendly, and they kind of failed in their public culture campaign that would have brought the settlers here back closer to the English mentality, which they had long ago left.
Yeah. You know, the interesting thing to me, I'm thinking more about Henry Knox again. I never realized how significant a figure he was in American history until really just not only when I heard Bob Lewis's talk about him, but Carolyn and I were in Rockland, Maine a couple of weeks ago. And interestingly, there's a Fort Knox in Rockland, in that area. And I always thought Fort Knox is where we store all the money, all the gold, but this is not that Fort Knox. This is not the Fort Knox, I guess, in New Jersey, but the Fort Knox in Maine. And it was built essentially to inhibit any incursions of the British from the north. And it's a remarkable place to visit. There's also, if you ever happen to travel through Rockland, Maine, or that area, you got to visit the Knox House and Museum. It's just a fantastic place. Lots of good history, lots of artifacts. we enjoyed that tremendously. And I thought when I was there, I kept thinking back to the presentation we had on Henry Knox's role in the Revolutionary period. Now, I do have one question for you before I turn it over to broader questions, Vincent. Now, as I understand, what we heard today is part of an evolution towards a book. And I'm just wondering, is the ETA on that book timed to appear at the when the national celebration occurs in 2026, or what's your ETA?
Well, originally I wasn't thinking of a book. I was simply thinking of helping to publicize what was underway until I discovered it was not underway. That the U.S. 250th Commission had failed, which was a shock. Federal money is being actually used by different people to sue each other. It's an embarrassment. One of the executive director type staff actually has been engaged in self-dealing with friends and family and has violated federal law. And the present administration is appointing a new executive director to try to get it going again. But here again, Massachusetts is perhaps a little slow, but way ahead of the curve.
Yeah.
And as I talked to Senator Barrett, who sent out a letter about this to a much broader audience, and who has a long interest in commitment in education, whatever else you may agree with.
Yeah.
I know some people are not happy with this climate stuff, but the history is very valuable and important. And so I realized that amazing number of teachers and people in local historical societies were only vaguely aware of July 4th of 2026, not 2025 or 2024. One of the few things I give my father credit for is having talked about the Suffolk Resolves repeatedly over the years and their importance. And in fact, there is some sketchy knowledge, and the regrowth of civics and civic education in the high schools coincides with this. So I will probably produce a small book or booklet first, and then see how much further it goes. The convention of towns was actually a total revelation to me. It's documented, but few people know of it. The Suffolk Resolved is better known by some, but still not as widely known as it ought to, because it just forthrightly says we're going to have a new government. And so what with the king and parliament in London, so they're mentioned in the Declaration of Independence as our friends, but not necessarily people we're going to pay much attention to.
Yeah, yeah. You know, your mentioning of Mike Barrett leads me to think that this might be a good time for me to do a little bit of housekeeping before I look for some more general questions. You folks know that our schedule includes a presentation on June 23rd by Ron Smith, the CEO of Innovations Toronto. He's going to talk about technological innovation. And then we will take July and August as a break. We'll come back in September, and our leadoff speaker on September 8th will be Bob Langer. Bob Langer is the founder of Moderna. He's an MIT faculty member who has a remarkable career both as a scientist, an engineer, and an innovator. And he's going to speak to us about the sort of mindset that leads to technological innovation and concern about societal well-being. Those are characteristics that are not always the motivation for for technologists to do things, but for Bob, they are. So I'm delighted that he's going to join us on September 8th. The early fall agenda is still evolving, but our thought is to focus on the electric grid in terms of its vulnerability, in terms of its growth and evolution, in terms of the politics that are associated with that process. And Mike Barrett comes to mind as someone I'd like to invite. I'm at the stage now where I'm getting some advice on who I should be inviting to give some of these talks. We're looking at probably three, maybe 4 talks on this subject in the fall. But Mike Barrett has been interested in energy issues, in addition to things like education and the historical comments that you've made, Vincent. And so I'm inclined to invite him. Vincent, I think I'm going to need your help with that, but since you have some contact with him, but I do think we're heading towards a very interesting fall, and I just wanted to give you a little bit of a heads up as we head towards our summer break. And
we can certainly do a little bit of collaboration or cooperation on that. I wound up talking to his chief of staff for about half an hour, and most of it was actually about getting the minimal state funding. Right now, there has not been any state funding for the state commission, but there have been 35 individuals appointed from the Mass Historical Society. Gavin Cleespies, you might recognize, who's the executive director of the Mass Historical Society, who is providing actually some supportive resources here. Mike Barrett, having been in the legislature for many years, has a variety of different portfolios. I was intersecting here primarily on the education and schooling areas and the civic literacy. He is one of those people who considers that if we're only having 180 days of school a year, and some of our competitors like Germany and Japan have 210 or 220 days a year, that our students are kind of getting off a little easy, and our teachers as well. And so he was an early advocate of that. And that's something where some of us may agree with him, though we may not agree on other things, but we'll follow that up together with you. The most important part here is that people need to kind of understand in Massachusetts in recent years has, for various reasons, dispensed with county government. And so regional cooperation on issues of history or regional events, or here security is an issue. The bicentennial had some real security problems. President Ford came and delivered some wonderful remarks at Old North Church and at the bridge at Old North, and yet hundreds of radicals tried to disrupt that, and I actually watched as about 25 horses were run into a crowd to protect President Ford in 1775. So some of us are slightly older than 30, but have still thankfully good memories. And there are some remarkable realities. Remember, there's an interesting aspect here that the militia elected their own officers. And people say we have a professional military. That is true, but the tradition of civilian control is still there. So any officer above a certain level who is appointed for promotion has to go in on a list to Congress. Particularly important about 6 or 7 years ago, as an Air Force general had covered up the misconduct at the Tailhook Convention, and senators objected to his appointment to be a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he was prevented from that appointment by civilian objection to a military person who had engaged in cover-up and misconduct. So there are still some interesting aspects of what was set down here originally, that civilian government is the starting point and that militia are important in other ways, but that there's a small d democratic mentality. And we still have that in most of us who are in towns where town government ultimately decides what the budget will be, how many police or fire there will be, how many teachers, what they'll get paid. Now, this is not very much the business of even Boston, let alone Washington. It's the business of your neighbors in the towns, in some cases the cities, that make Massachusetts the, shall we say, challenging dynamic at times, but also small d democratic mentality.
Yeah. You know, it's always interesting to me when you ask a historian a question, you always get a historical answer. That was a historical answer, which touched on a number of other issues. And
as I say, I'm slightly over 30, but I'm still not as old as some of the geniuses who, at a time when life was a lot shorter, it's interesting that the people who were using their minds did live into their 70s and 80s.
Yeah. But, you know, one of the things you touched on in responding, and you presented earlier in your talk, you said there was a sort of a national programmatic failure on the part of people in Washington, or where, in terms of
it was a set of appointments by the national administration with a range of people who seemed okay, and perhaps a few would-be donors or financial people, and the thing just collapsed, and there was misconduct. It happens in all organizations. But not to make too fine a point of it, to some extent, the important historical landmarks of Massachusetts were left out of some of the early stuff. And even people who might come from Texas or California, I've known from prior years, come because they want to see Massachusetts and know what happened here, even
Yeah.
if they don't necessarily agree with our politics. They are aware that the fact that they have a constitution is important. Remember that all 50 states of the United States have their own constitution. Some of our newer parts like Puerto Rico or Guam, or the most recent new Commonwealth of the United States is the Northern Marianas. If you look at the back of your quarters, you'll see the Northern Marianas Commonwealth in the back of a quarter, and they have their own government elected under the United States, and they're less than 2,000 miles from Japan. So the United States continues to have a dynamic. Of course, much argument as to who should be admitted as a state, but everyone still gets to send a delegate to Congress in Washington and to have the broad protection of the U.S. Constitution and that original inspiration.
Yeah. But just to return to the point, though, I mean, so is there now a reconstituted national effort that is moving forward, or what is the national?
That is the attempt. A new official or two have been named. I'm going to follow that over the next month and see what happens. We should get some type of announcement on July 4th of this year as to where they're going.
I see.
But at this point, they will be at least a little behind the curve, if not a lot. There will be focused primarily on July 4th of 1776 or 2026. Will be focused largely, the Revolution 250 and the State Commission really will be focused on 2023 December, the Boston Tea Party. There was a little bit of a skip step here because the Boston Massacre was observed on March 5th of 2020, and then about 5 days later, we were all shut down. So we lost a little bit of a skip there, but people who are aware, and part of our job is to push out the history, the civics, and recognize that the federal structure means that we are self-governing and largely responsible for our own unique aspects.
Sure. Let's see, let me turn to the rest of the crew. Are there questions or comments that anyone else would like to bring forward?
Yeah, hi, this is Tom Opar. Yeah, I did have one question. I didn't grow up in Massachusetts, so I don't know much about Massachusetts history. And so this was actually pretty revelatory. But you said that the Suffolk Resolves, September 1774, Massachusetts became an independent country. Is that correct?
Clearly. Remember, the charter at first, in the case of Plymouth, was meant to be the northern reaches of Virginia. They were blown off course. They wind up in Plymouth. They create their own document, the Mayflower Compact. The charter for Massachusetts Bay, they are very careful that everyone who's a stockholder in the Massachusetts Bay Company sails with the ships. There is no office in London. There is no forwarding address. If you want to cross the ocean 2 or 3 months on a not frequent flyer sailing ship. So they have literally, when they had their stockholder meetings here, they simply opened it to all church members. So even if you didn't have money, if you were active in the church, you probably had a franchise. The first franchise was in the church, the call from the pews with ideological and theological guidance. So there's really about 5 different answers as to when Massachusetts became independent. The most original one is 1630 with the charter, which still resides over at Columbia Point, because they travel government to themselves through church state. In terms of the British Empire, if you had any ambiguity, it is 1774 because John Hancock, who is president of the Provincial Congress and therefore of Massachusetts, says Massachusetts is independent of England and the British Empire. And notice he uses both phrases. But to some extent, there was an independence reinforced when Sir Edmund Andros, after 3 years, is arrested by his own militia. And the government is restored by a document that had been vacated in London. So you see, Massachusetts is choosing its own constitutional path from 1689 without any ambiguity. And when there's a royal governor who shows up based on the 1701 period, the governor's council continues to insist that they have review. So in fact, even to this day, The governor's council is the one that decides whether a pardon or a commutation of sentence is awarded. The governor cannot do that on his or her own. There's certain other powers as well. The Attorney General of Massachusetts is actually more powerful because the Attorney General can decide if your town warrant that was passed is constitutional or should be ruled out, or insist on town government doing certain things that conform to the Constitution. And the governor doesn't have those powers. And this is, of course, noticing that the governor used to be a royal appointee and couldn't be trusted. So local officials are the ones whose independent franchise are the ones who can and should be trusted in a very significant way.
Let's good. Let's go on to Eddie.
Yes, I find it always very interesting that that systems of government, systems of organization have much deeper roots than most people imagine. And I think you sort of go back to the Magna Carta, but it could even go back further than that. And so I would love to see, quite frankly, a kind of plot of how institutions and modern government have its roots going far back. And I think Massachusetts has, even in its constitutions and the points that you have made, sort of also go back perhaps to how things were organized in England, in some of the independent towns and cities that arose during, well, after the Roman Empire actually fell. So I'm just wondering as well if there is historical information you can take from English sources as well as American sources about the way in which things unfolded in the New England colonies.
Certainly, because the dissenters in England actually, to some extent, won here and didn't really have an influence in England until later in the 1800s, when the rotten boroughs, where a few people elected a member of parliament and 100,000 people only elected one, or the changes in the monarchy or the changes in parliament, those changes don't really affect England until the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. Here, we're well beyond that. Now talking about abolition and maintaining the Union by ending slavery. By the way, Massachusetts had ended slavery by 1790 with the Quock Walker case, which will be briefly noted a little later this month with a small holiday around Juneteenth. And again, this evolution. So Edmund Burke, the ideas of John Locke and others, the Wilkes and Liberty was a mass movement in England for reform that took a while to get going. We actually had the good fortune that somebody who was a descendant of Wilkes actually lived in Eastern Massachusetts, ran for office, was a lawyer of some reputation. When my father said Oscar about Wilkes, it turned out she was a direct descendant, and went on for the next 15 minutes to tell me what Wilkes meant to American liberty. It was pretty striking. There was somebody talking in the language of the 17 and 1800s about English freedom and American embracement of what were dissenters in England, and increasingly people who carried the torch here. And of course, the introduction of Christmas from the German and English roots that came to be political here. The political roots of the fact we drink coffee or that we give Paul Revere bowls are interesting symbols of the dynamic of that. A little less understood today, but still quite important. And as civic literacy comes back, I have no doubt that we will embrace that in significant ways. Whatever you think of the politics of the matter, Massachusetts law actually in the late 1700s embraced all English common law since 1215. And that has had some significant impact. So when women wanted to keep their names, a clever lawyer said, give me a couple weeks for doing a little research to the judge, came back and said, well, if you were a common man, you'd have to surrender your name to the noble woman that you were to marry, because what mattered was nobility. And what mattered was that gradually we have democratized all the rights of nobility versus the king. And so, Your Honor, would you please order that? And from that point, women were able to choose their own names as men, as anyone, in a way known by the law of nobility in England. And they didn't need to go through an extended battle in the legislature where people were arrayed against each other versus old school or new school. They simply sampled directly from English common law. And that's one of the more remarkable things in different aspects. Tony and others who are lawyers may have better or different views on that. But it's interesting that it's not just the law since the late 1700s, but law going back to at least the 1200s. And as you correctly point out, many other aspects. And the United States and Massachusetts in particular have influenced law here and in other countries as well.
Vincent, I'm always sensitive to time, given that we're approaching 12 noon, but I do have one final question that I hope we can get in before we call it a day. You mentioned that Maine was at one point a part of Massachusetts, and I'm wondering whether it was actually part of Massachusetts or part of what was known as the Massachusetts Bay Colonies. Is there what is the accurate representation of that association between Maine and Massachusetts?
Massachusetts and Maine are separated in 1820 based on the compromise that one free state and one slave state would be admitted. But there was some tendency in Maine to think the people in Boston were far, far away.
Yeah.
And so the separation happened sort of more or less peaceably. New Hampshire was actually a little more clouded because it hadn't originally had any particular land grant. But the people in Maine were largely just under Boston. They would come to Boston for government matters. Well, there are people who work in Boston to this day who live in Maine and vice versa.
But I mean,
and one of the other things more interesting, I think, is that Maine in some ways has kept on evolving. So Maine has led New England in people electing independents or people not a member of a political party. Several times electing that, and Massachusetts is headed in that direction. Now, 61% of the registered voters in Massachusetts do not belong to a political party, which shows that the sell-by date has already gone. And New England, within its context, is really quite a maverick to itself, let alone the United States. Right. But it's why it's evolving in significant ways to this day. Not surprising, biotech, the MIT. Remember the Morrow Land Grant, by the way, MIT comes out of that. Could have been done by the Ivy League. Harvard and Yale and Dartmouth failed to pick up the Morrow Land Grant coherently. Now Harvard and MIT are perhaps working around that corner in a different way.
You mean the school up the Massachusetts Avenue, the other school on Massachusetts Avenue? No, I'm sorry.
Well, and there's a school south of here. Ron, there is that school south of here that we are want to occasionally mention, otherwise known as Yale or Blue.
You know, okay. I was going to tell an MIT joke about Harvard, but I won't do that. I think I'll restrain myself. Vincent, I want to thank you once again for joining us and providing this interesting historical perspective as we get closer to the 1776 national events. I hope we'll hear more about this from you, and I appreciate your giving us this heads up. So I want to thank you, and I'll bring this meeting to a close. Thank everyone who joined us, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks with Ron Smith from Innovations Toronto. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Yep. Have a good weekend.
Thank you, Vincent. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thanks, Bob. Bye-bye.
Bye.